Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Dr. Brendan Murray about how different approaches to consumer neuroscience work together and dispel some of the myths surrounding neuroscience.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to this series on understanding consumer neuroscience. My guest today is Brendan Murray. And Brendan, maybe you need to tell us a little bit about yourself. A PhD in neuroscience?
Indeed, a PhD in neuroscience. Had an interesting path through to this industry. Started as a psychology major in college. Love the subject matter. You know, college, you kind of get exposed when you pick something to major in to pretty much everything. There's a lot of breadth and not a whole lot of depth.
Right.
But I realized pretty quickly that the cognitive science aspects were ones that I could get a handle on pretty easily. And my strategy in college was the things that I could get a handle on easily without having to do a lot of work. That kind of ended up guiding what I went into.
Let's, just optimizing for aptitude, right? That you had an aptitude for these things.
Just trying to be as efficient a system as humanly possible. And if I could do something well with not a lot of work, that was going to be where I ended up going.
But presumably it also interests you, which means it didn't feel like a lot of work either.
Yeah, so that was the dirty little secret, right? It was easy, and then I realized I was actually interested in it.
Yeah.
And then I would find that I was taking some time on weekends to actually read more about some of the topics that I was learning about in my classes, which was kind of a foreign idea to me at the time.
Yeah. You have that meta moment where you're just like, I'm reading this for fun. How did this happen?
Yeah. And your friends are kind of looking at you a little bit weird, like, hey, we're all going out to party right now. Why are you still sitting in front of your computer? I'll be along in a couple minutes. I just need to finish this one thing up. And then finished college and kind of had that sort of unfinished feeling. Like there was still a bit more to know about some of those topics, which, looking back, exceedingly naive, there was an infinite amount more to know about those topics.
Of course.
But that was really what made me realize that I wanted to go to graduate school, actually pursue some of these a bit more deeply, be able to do some of my own research. So I got my PhD in cognitive psychology, specializing in the interaction between human emotion and memory. So the ways in which across the adult lifespan, we remember emotional events differently from non-emotional events. Things like your graduation day, a wedding day, a funeral, differently from what you had for breakfast last Wednesday.
Okay.
And
you actually wrote a thesis paper around this? I mean, I always presume that on a PhD. It's like there's a paper out there somewhere with your name on it.
I did. Yeah, there are plenty of papers for anybody who's interested in understanding how we create mentalized unitizations of emotional and non-emotional nouns and verbs. There's a whole lot of reading with my name on it that you can do in your free time.
I'm struggling with the word unitization. That's a good one.
Yeah. So the whole idea was around, many things in the world around us have some emotional connotation to them. Actually, most things, in fact. And that's something that is not immediately apparent to most people when you hear the word emotion. We hear emotion and we think of it in the sense of you're watching a sad movie and you're crying, or you're watching a comedy or somebody's telling you jokes and you're laughing, and all of those things that are very sort of overt, expressed emotional responses. In cognitive science, when we talk about emotion, what we're really talking about is your brain identifying something as being relevant in your environment, and therefore important to prioritize for things like going into memory, directing your attention, helping to shape future behavior. And they can be very, very small things. Things like a door slamming in another room, or seeing a picture of a child walking across a street.
Right. Although those both represent like different species of threat. Unknown abrupt noise versus child in danger. That's still kind of, that to me seems like chemistry. Like chemicals are now released in my brain to fire up some stuff.
Yes. And there is a very good reason why that happens. And it's evolution. right?
These are survival tactics.
For thousands and thousands of years, as a species, we've evolved to keep ourselves alive, and also to keep others around us alive, because that's helped us survive long term. And so that's why we're constantly going through this process in the world around us of evaluating information in front of us for its emotional content.
Right.
Basically being able to say, what are the things that I can just totally ignore because we're constantly bombarded with stimuli around us? And what are the things that I actually need to kind of focus some cognitive resources on right now, because it may be important to me at some point in the near or distant future. That's really all we're talking about when we talk about emotion in the world around us. And that's kind of one of the key things in consumer neuroscience that we're trying to measure, in more applied settings.
And I immediately go back to like early humans in the savannah, kind of, that instead of a door slam, it's a snap of a branch that could be a predator behind me. And the same thing, child getting too far away from being safe, or too close to the water where the alligators might be. All the very same sort of stimuli. But do you think, in theory, we're living in a safer world today, in theory, but also this demand on our attention, I mean, isn't this a unique time in human history that there's so many things coming at us, or is it just so many things coming at us that aren't actually important?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of both. We certainly live in a world now where we are just consistently inundated with things that are competing for our attention in various ways. And the reason that to this point we haven't quite gotten better at adapting to shutting those things out is, well, evolution works really, really slowly. But one of the things that helps keep us alive is the fact that heightened sensitivity to things that carry emotional information is very generalized. It's much, much better for our survival to accidentally pay attention to something that's not truly important,
right,
than it is to accidentally miss something that would be really important.
Yeah. You only get to make that mistake once.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to notice something that you didn't need to. Historically, there was maybe only one or two opportunities to miss something that you really needed to see.
Yeah.
And the exponential rise in technology, which you're very familiar with over the last several decades, have also introduced a lot of new modalities for us to kind of engage our senses,
right,
or different opportunities for us to have those experiences where we're encountering things that may or may not be important to us. And so certainly as technology becomes increasingly ubiquitous and permeating more and more parts of our lives, engaging other senses than it did before, audio, visual, etc., there's going to be even greater need for that kind of filtering function that our brain serves to be able to narrow down, all right, this stuff is all noise, this stuff is signal. We're going to pay attention to this stuff that we're identifying right now as signal. If we're wrong, oops, hope we don't die.
Yeah.
If we're right, all right, cool, it's going to help us in the long run.
But is it only really threat responses? Are there other calls to attention that are not threat-based? I'm just thinking in terms of building my marketing campaign where it's like, do I have to scare my customers? Is that the only thing that works, so to speak?
So it's a really great question. There's a very, very broad and interesting body of literature and emotion research that looks at the differences between how we respond to positive and negative stimuli. When there's something negative in our environment that our brain detects, we tend to have this sort of response where we zero in on that thing and we capture an unbelievable amount of data around what that thing is that we've identified as being negative. And usually that comes at the expense of everything else that's around it. This has been talked about a lot in the legal literature as the weapon focus effect. It was originally published by Elizabeth Loftus, where you're in an alley, somebody pulls a gun on you, you are laser focused on that gun because that is the immediate threat to your survival.
Right.
And your memory for the features of that gun come at the expense of something like the face of the person who is pointing the gun at you.
Right.
Because all of your resources are locked in there. Positive information tends to have the opposite effect because, again, evolutionarily, things that are positive for us don't necessarily need some kind of immediate action the way that a threat does. If we see something positive, we actually tend to take in more information about the surrounding context for it because the context is probably really important.
Sure.
Hey, where did I find that oasis of water, for example?
Yeah.
You need to know all the features and details around the environment. And so we've kind of over time, we've progressed from that to things that are positive in emotionality, tend to have a halo effect to everything around them. Whereas things that are negative, you get really, really focused on the specific aspects of the negative thing.
And it totally makes sense. The location where you got mugged is actually not that important. You probably won't go back there, right?
Right, exactly. But the features of the person who mugged you could actually be really important.
Yes. Sociologically, long term, like it's interesting, of course, that because we're a tool building creature, that it turns out the tool's the bigger threat than the individual operating it. So we memorize the tool and kind of miss the individual. Like that's a subtlety of we've already beaten our own evolution. I have to wonder when it was a spear, were you more focused on the spear than the person holding it? I don't know the answer to that. Like that's curious.
I would imagine that it would have been the case.
Yeah.
That you would have had the spear focus effect.
Yeah.
As opposed to, something like a gun focus effect.
Yeah, the firearm. But but ultimately, the fact that you found a location for water, the water's not the interesting part. The location's the interesting part. And that's where our mind should go to for that positive thing is how do I get back to where this positive effect is?
Exactly. And then, when we think about, we'll make a huge leap here to present day. You're a marketer. How do you actually utilize this kind of information?
Yeah.
We talk about this a lot when we look at things like video advertising, for example. We'll talk very frequently about the halo effect that certain elements within a scene that do a good job of, for lack of a better term, emotionally engaging people, that halo effect that it will have on their memory of or their impression of what's going to come immediately beforehand. So a lot of times when we think about measuring some kind of physiological or emotional response from a consumer as they're watching an ad, we tend to try to push marketers to have moments within their ads that are coming towards the end of the ad that are emotionally evocative in some way. Because at the very end of the ad is usually the final branding.
Right.
It's your company's name, it's the image of the product, all of those things. By having something preceding that's emotional, you're kind of tapping into this ability to get people to generalize that emotional response to whatever is temporally or spatially around the thing that got the response from them.
Without a doubt, we've seen that work. When we think about memorable ads, it is that emotional tug. It's those pieces. It's the use of babies in a stock trading app, like all of these mechanisms designed to create that initial emotional response that then it kind of clicks on the recorders.
Absolutely. And a lot of it comes down to the quality of creative, right? So, the E-Trade Baby example that you just mentioned is a great one because what are we, 15, 18 years later, we're calling it the E-Trade Baby.
Yeah.
E-Trade did a great job of associating their name and their brand with that very memorable campaign and that baby. It can also work completely against you, right? If you don't do a good job of positioning your brand, again, either in time or in space within your advertising to the thing that's getting an emotional response from people. Think about the example that I always go to is auto ads. And I've used this example at conferences before, and a lot of people have. If you think about kind of the stereotypical auto ad sequence where you've got the car driving through the winding road in the mountains and it's cool and you've got the exhilarating music and whatever else, what brand is known for doing that car ad? I couldn't tell you.
All of them. Yeah.
Exactly. All of them. There's no kind of ownership of that very memorable element that you've seen many, many times. It looks cool. It's well stylized. Everybody has their own take on how to do it. But everybody has their own take on how to do it.
Yeah.
And there's no proximity necessarily to the brand itself. And so at the end of it, it's like, oh, I saw a car ad.
It's not negative, but it's not effective either. Because I could, another emotion is revulsion. So, I certainly we've run into this in technology spaces where it's like, you don't make the robot that's almost humanish. Because if it's not, you get into that uncanny valley effect and it actually repels people. You don't want to be remembered as being repellent. That's not a good thing either.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that there are circumstances where in most traditional advertising, repulsing the consumer would be considered a pretty bad idea. And if you're at a creative agency, that's probably going to lose you your job.
Yeah.
There are some domains where that would actually be the intuitive route to go. So one example to think of, which has been well documented in behavioral literature, is something like anti-smoking ads,
right, of course,
which have over the years leaned in very, very heavily on the negative side effects or the consequences of smoking, showing people with stomas, cancer warnings and everything else.
Yeah, damaged lungs, all of those kinds of things. And it's a PSA, it's in your best interest not to smoke, and it really is in your best interest not to smoke. So we're using those chemical receptors to record that idea into your mind.
But what's super, super interesting is that it's really not an effective way to get people to change their behavior.
Interesting.
Playing on negative does not work well. And this has been shown with anti-smoking PSAs. In some cases, actually, that it's had the opposite effect, where it's actually primed smoking behavior. Because one of the things that we do very, very well as humans is we like to protect ourselves. We like to protect our egos. Right. And if I'm a smoker, which I'm not, but if I were a smoker, I would want to be avoidant of things that are a threat to myself. In other words, being reminded of my mortality and the fact that I'm doing damage to my lungs and to my body and all of these other things. So if I see an anti-smoking ad, I'm essentially going to tune out from that and not pay attention to the message.
Right.
But what will have gotten through is that prime of smoking.
Right.
And that'll have actually made me think about cigarettes.
I want to smoke.
And so you can actually prime smoking behavior through those anti-smoking PSAs with smokers. I did some work maybe 2 or 3 years ago with an agency called Boncom. They're part of Bonneville Communications, looking at safe driving PSAs. So what's the most effective way to essentially get people not to text and drive?
Right.
Or just to pay attention to the road.
Don't drive too fast. All of those sorts of bad behaviors that we have when driving.
Precisely. And they actually wanted to look at this empirically. They wanted to collect some neuroscientific data to be able to look at what actually is the most effective way to craft a PSA. Is it going to be kind of the typical anti-smoking route of focusing on the negative consequences? So having some PSAs of, people causing accidents, hitting kids that are playing in the road, et cetera, because they were distracted and looking at their phone. They tested a few that were more humor based. So showing people walking around a town while they're looking at their phones and, falling down manholes and walking into fences or lampposts, whatever else.
Right.
And they looked at a couple that were just information based. So those PSAs that were essentially centered around, hey, here are some strategies to remind yourself not to look at your phone while you're driving. Tie a piece of string to your finger so that when you look down, you see the string and you remember to look at the road instead of your phone. And what we found through the data that we had collected in our lab, and we can we'll talk in a bit about what some of those methodologies were.
For sure.
We saw the ones that were the most emotionally engaging for the audiences were actually the humor-based ones and not the ones focused on the negative consequences. And they tracked behavior in the geographic area that they were running some of these PSAs over. I can't remember what the time period was, but some period of time afterwards. And they actually found that there was a more measurable shift in behavior in terms of traffic accidents in the areas that they had run the humor-based PSAs.
So this is confusing to me because we started out this conversation with you're wired to protect yourself from threats. That will give you the most effective emotional response. And humor is literally not a threat, and yet was the more effective ad.
But humor is positive, and it broadens you to everything else that you're looking at in the context. So the idea would be, and this isn't necessarily something that can be measured in the moment, but the idea would be that if you are giving people something that is positive in emotionality, that they're essentially more receptive to everything else that's going on.
To changing behavior.
Precisely.
So, when we've done a series of these now, and we've talked in terms of things you do in a grocery store to make your product easier to find when you have brand recognition, ways to encourage purchasing or interest in a product. But a PSA is a very different creature again. I'm asking you to change behavior for your own benefit and the benefit of civilization around us. And it seems like it's best served by humor.
Yeah. And, purely speculatively, but we can think about reasons why that might be, right? If we are in an emotional state in the moment when we're seeing some type of messaging, and it's a positive emotional state, whether it's been elicited by humor or by something else, we're doing a better job of taking in all of the information around us and essentially putting it into the contextual network that our brain hangs onto for us to help us navigate the world. And so you can think of whether that's activating within that network those sorts of associations with not just my survival, but the survival of others, or whether it's just making it easier for us to relate that information to things that we've learned in the past. That's basically our entire process of learning, is when we encounter new information, seeing how related it is to things that we already know and understand and potentially do ourselves, and kind of doing that analysis of how easily can I understand this? How easily can I put this with other things that I know or other things that I do that are going to benefit me? And if it benefits other people, that's great.
Yeah, it's an interesting context for all those things. And admittedly, what you were describing as the humorous ones were all sort of slapstick humor. Falling down a manhole cover or walking into something, like quite possibly those people were injured too. Like there was a threat element here, even though our physiological response to that sort of slapstick thing is at least some amusement, at the same time, maybe a bit shocking too. Like it really does tie the two pieces together of caring for someone else, like this reminder that we're in a civilization and should do right by them. Like you had an emotional response to that person's accident, and then tying it in with this, your behavior can be harm to others. Like it's a very interesting, very specific scenario for that PSA.
Yeah. And one of the things that we do really well is we read context into situations. Our brain essentially tries to act as a puzzle master that's constantly putting missing pieces together.
Even at the expense of making them up.
Right, exactly. And in a lot of cases, making them up incorrectly, which we could probably spend an entire other episode talking about places where this goes wrong. But within those PSAs, the responses probably would have been very different if there were visuals of those people actually getting injured, right?
Right.
The responses probably would have been very different if the soundtrack hadn't been this, light, bouncy, poppy, airy kind of music behind it, but rather had been the type of soundtrack that you would associate with a horror movie or a drama. Sure. Even if the visuals were exactly the same, this is when we talk about, our brain is acting as this filter to try to help us navigate the world. Things like those audio cues are incredibly important. And we've seen this in studies that we've done before. Something like just changing the soundtrack and keeping visuals, narration, everything else identical. You can create very different responses from viewers simply based on those features. So it's a carefully coordinated concert on the part of creators.
Sure.
And there are a lot of kind of levers that you can pull to sort of push people in one direction or the other in terms of how they'll respond to something. But there's also a lot of places where, without even realizing it, you can do that very, very wrong and elicit responses that you were not intending at all.
Well, I think that also backs us into this broader conversation around consumer neuroscience, which is, and as you described, the testing part of it. Like we've now talked about this idea that some slapstick comedy can be an effective vehicle for certain classes of work, but you also have to do it right. And you don't necessarily know what do it right looks like. Even when you get it right once, that may not be right for the next problem space you're working in.
And that's exactly one of the reasons why I love working in this industry so much, is that it is kind of consistently trying to define where those very squishy and, in a lot of cases, moving boundaries are. The hope for any client in really any industry is that there's a blueprint that can be followed. A set of very specific rules.
Give me the checklist.
And that becomes even a checklist that they can go down and say, I did this, I did this, I did this. And that's even more true with something like neuroscience, which, for many people, they didn't major in psychology or neuroscience in college. They haven't gone on to graduate school. And so it feels like one of those kind of esoteric sorts of things that, okay, this is a hard science. We know how to read people's minds. give us the list of things that we need to do to make sure that our message gets across as effectively as possible.
Right.
And of course, it's much blurrier than that. And there's a lot more work that has to go in on the part of the folks that are providing the research, because we're kind of using a lot of certainly what's known in the science in terms of how the human brain works to the best of our knowledge at this point.
Right.
And then also, like any other research industry, our own experience. What have we seen be successful in the past? What are some of the things that we've seen be not so successful? Where are those exception cases or those fringe cases where things don't work? And what are the interpretations or recommendations that we can give to people? You know, saying something like humor works or puppies and babies work is all well and good. And that's what a lot of people hope for. But I could easily just rattle off the top of my head, here are 5 cases where humor would be a terrible idea, where puppies and babies would be the worst possible thing that you can do to try to get your message across.
No, and I think we could probably think of a few of them, right? But it's an interesting truth. Like, all of these axiomatic misstatements are almost certainly a mistake. It does feel to me like you have to craft a hypothesis, which is ultimately going to be manifest as creative, and then take it out for a spin before you spend the money to roll it out large.
And I think that that's been one of the greatest difficulties that I've encountered in my career in this industry, right? Is that, yes, we're doing essentially market research, but we are also, as best we can, trying to do basic science. And basic science is hypothesis driven. It's not mind reading or divination or anything else, which, you know, I think there's certainly a perception amongst a lot of folks
that can be useful for the mind reader when they're right, but doesn't make it accurate.
Right, exactly. Anytime I talk to clients, we sit down, I try to get to know their business as best as possible, try to understand what the business question is that they're trying to answer, or business questions. And in my mind, I'm constantly going through this process of, okay, how do I turn this into something that's actually testable, in the sense that I can create a real yes or no hypothesis out of, that I can then bring in some set of tools, bring some people into a lab, collect some data, and determine, all right, does this support or does it not support the hypothesis that I had? So I can come up with some recommendations to go back to the client. It's a very delicate dance to come up with, because a lot of people come in hoping that, okay, so you're going to be able to know what my consumers are thinking and feeling and wanting. Here are 3 ads. Tell me what to do with them.
Yeah, which one's the right one?
The bane of my existence is which one of these is the best? Well, how do you define what's the best?
Yeah.
What are your objectives? What are you trying to get to?
Yeah, what would we measure?
What are the specific things that you're interested in? Is this working? Is this not? We need to cull this down to something that can actually be turned into a lab-based research question that we can collect data on and determine some semblance of an answer.
And in your PSA story, like, that's a really challenging one. When the real metric that matters is the change of people's behavior over time. How do you test that?
And that is one of the trickiest things to try to figure out, because I always go back to this. You know, fortunately over the years there have been a handful of very good, very well done validation studies that have been executed in the industry, where companies have given the research provider some set of materials to test, and then they've actually tracked real world outcome behavior against them that could be lined up with the lab-based results.
Right.
But when we think about validation, what I usually say to people is, you know, again, we'll stay with advertising testing as an example. If somebody gives me 2 ads, and their question is, which one of these ads should I run next week? They're not going to run the ad that doesn't test as well. They're going to run the one that tests better. Maybe that ad that didn't test so well would have been the best ad that they've ever created.
Yeah.
And they have no way of knowing, because nobody's going to do that kind of in-market A/B testing with these things. So the holy grail is being able to get some sort of real world outcome data, whether it's for the PSAs actually being able to track something like traffic incidents within a specific region that only ran some of those PSAs over a period of time, whether it's being able to get something like single source data so that you know that households that were exposed to an advertisement also purchased products that were advertised during some period of time. That's the missing link for so many studies. And that's not unique to neuroscience either. It's unique to a lot of different types of market research.
For the
Having
most part,
that ground truth outcome is a really hard thing to get to.
Well, I think it's just an association problem. Typically, we're doing it some form of broadcast advertising, or even targeted advertising. Like, it's actually very tough to do a tracking chain from that ad product to that purchase or that action that was desired, whatever it may be. Like, to keep that chain alive, to say, in the end, this sale is associated with that piece of marketing. Not even to say the fact that we're abundantly aware that it's not one piece of marketing, that it's a composite of these things together that ultimately leads to a positive outcome.
And that's the other challenge too, that I've talked with many clients over the years, which is that, you can come up with the best piece of creative in the world. How's the rest of your marketing campaign?
Yeah.
What is the rollout schedule? How is your targeting in terms of the audience that you're going to be showing this to, right? Because great creative that's going to the wrong audience, or it's going to the right audience at the wrong time, may as well not exist in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you really have wasted money. It does take all of those pieces together. And that's outside the realm of the problem of consumer neuroscience. But I do buy into this idea that we have a thought to, well, maybe can we walk through this scenario with particularly the distracted driving PSA is great, because you define, somebody come up with 3 distinctly different ideas. Because I think we all come in with an initial bias around distracted driving, that it's everybody else does it, you never do it. And that, it's the reflex is that's bad. Don't be a bad person. Like, the negative is the easy one to do. Like, I think it takes a while to get to the humor solution.
No, absolutely. And that is when we think about how we speak effectively to audiences. How do you talk to an audience that doesn't know that they have a problem that you're trying to solve?
Right.
And distracted driving is a great one, right? I never text and drive. I never check my phone unless I see that it's my wife's name that popped up.
Yeah.
Well, I was on the way to the grocery store, and what if it's an emergency? I'll look quickly. It'll be totally fine. Right. But that's not the example that comes to mind when we think of distracted driving.
I wasn't distracted.
No, I was fully in control. I was watching the road the whole time. I simply glanced down at my phone. A distracted driver is somebody who's holding their phone up in front of them and Instagramming while they're driving on the highway. That's certainly not me. An excellent example of that is going on right now worldwide, right? Which is how do you convince people who are skeptical or outright averse to being vaccinated for COVID-19 that they should indeed receive the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is a big area of research right now that both of the companies that I'm affiliated with, Cloud Army and Dirt, we're trying to work with various groups on to understand how do you get effective messaging across to groups that aren't interested in the message to begin with.
Yeah. Or even actively resistant to it.
Or actively resistant to it. And it's a very difficult nut to crack. For me, the place that I always start with anything that I'm working on is that when we go back to the original definition of emotion that I gave earlier, which is essentially, it's not crying in a movie theater. It's not laughing at a comedy show. It's simply our brain flagging something as being relevant. That means that the best way to elicit an emotional response from people is to give them something that is perceived as being personally relevant to them.
Right.
At the end of the day, we're all very egocentric and selfish people. We're looking for things that are important to us individually, and finding those angles to be able to make something personally relevant for somebody is kind of a lens that I'm always thinking of. Is your audience going to care about this message at all or not? And when we think about something like vaccinations, how do you make that personally relevant to a group that really doesn't feel like it's relevant to them, or they feel like it's relevant in the opposite way of what you're trying to convince them of? Changing that messaging and changing that story, finding the things that they do care about and that are really relevant to them, and being able to link vaccine adoption behavior to those things is a challenge, but it's certainly not an insurmountable one.
Sure.
And it's kind of one of those things that you have to maybe throw the kitchen sink at a bit with as many ideas as you can think of, and then test them out,
right?
Run them through the lab, get some data, and understand, hey, it seems to be there's an angle here of something that's kind of resonant with these folks. Let's push that a little further and see how effective we can get.
So what does running it through the lab look like? How do you do that?
Yeah, I'm using a real catch-all term there.
You sure
for
are.
Something that is
magic happens here.
Unbelievably complex. Even the term running it through the lab isn't really accurate, because a lot of neuroscience can happen online, especially during a pandemic right now, where bringing people into a lab can be very difficult or impossible.
Right.
But there's a broad suite of different tools, all adopted from academic neuroscience and psychology, that each of them can be very, very effective at honing in on specific parts of human cognition. So I think that's firstly, one of the most important things to understand is that there is no single tool, no single methodology in any industry at any company that is going to be able to tell you this is what people are thinking and feeling at this given moment in time.
Right.
What we do have we have a toolbox of tools that can tell you how relatively positive or negative did people feel about whatever it was that you presented them with. How strong or how weak of a response did they have? Not necessarily how good or bad, but is this something that people responded to physiologically or not?
Right.
What captured their overt visual attention? So what did they actually look at versus what did they miss? So there are a number of different tools that allow us to get each of those little slices of people's experience with whatever it is that we're testing. And part of my job is understanding, based on the business problem that a client has, what's the best combination of those tools to actually get at what it is that they care about and that they're trying to answer.
So it's the answer is not do all the tests. Like there's certain tests that'll be more effective in certain scenarios than others.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been one of the challenges too within the industry, I think, over a number of years, is that there have been a number of establishments that have felt that throwing every possible methodology at a question is the best way to do it.
Sure. Very brute force.
Yeah. And brute force, you're going to hit on what you need to, but you're also going to end up with a lot of stuff that's probably not useful to you, which is fine if you know what to throw out and what to look at. But if you're collecting 6 different modalities of data, you're going to feel compelled to come up with an interpretation for all 6 of those.
Rationalize them all.
Make that rationalization. And one of the things that, folks in this industry are really good at is storytelling and coming up with stories.
Of course.
And myself included, I have learned over many years how to speak client, so to speak, and be able to, give them a compelling look at what the data says. Always trying to be as accurate as humanly possible, but there are a lot of folks who don't necessarily know where that line should be. And they're going to feel like, well, hey, I collected facial expression data on this study. I don't care what the statistics say. I've got to say something about facial expressions, because otherwise I'm going to have a client saying, why did you charge me money to collect facial expression data? So it's really not the case of do everything. It's what are the right tools for this particular job that we're going to bring to bear?
That's fascinating stuff. And, I think in the computing side, where I spent more of my time, we're learning pretty quickly that you just don't throw every possible variable at a machine learning model. You end up with a lot of noise, that those things that move significantly are far more important, and that simplified models get better results.
Yeah.
So it sounds very orthogonal to that.
Yeah. And Richard, it's a great example, right? Because when you throw every variable possible into a machine learning model, eventually the machine starts making sense of all of that noise.
Right.
It starts to find patterns in the noise that aren't actually really indicative of anything, aside from the fact that you gave it a whole bunch of data to look at. And it's completely analogous to the consumer neuroscience industry.
Same problem.
If you look at the same set of garbage data 15 different ways, you'll find an interesting story that you want to tell people.
Right.
Is it a story that's actually going to make a business impact for your client or make a behavioral shift in the group that they're trying to speak to? Probably not.
Yeah. But it's a good story. And it looks like it worked hard.
Yeah, it's a great story. Got some beautiful looking slides out of it.
So how do you choose? Like, what is the repertoire of testing instruments you have? I mean, we've talked a bit in this series already about things like implicit testing and reaction time testing. There's more, I presume.
Yes, yeah, there are certainly more. Implicit testing is a great tool because it can tap into a couple of things that the more lab-based neuroscience tools really can't. Things like associations with positivity versus negativity, specific vocabulary associations. When people see my brand name, do they associate it with family-friendly or healthy or things like that?
Which I found are dreadful questions on surveying. Like just how to get bad data. Ask people directly, is this family-friendly?
Yeah, people are... Generally, as humans, we are not reliable reporters of what we're thinking and feeling. But one of the things that I always try to impress upon people is that for a long time, there was a perception that the consumer neuroscience industry's intent was to supplant traditional research and traditional methodologies like surveys and focus groups. And in my opinion, that absolutely is not and should not be the case. I think of a bit of an oversimplification, but I think that it helps get the point across to a lot of folks. I think of them as serving very different functions. When we are giving somebody an implicit test online, or we're bringing them into a lab and we're measuring their galvanic skin response, what we're really capturing is kind of a non-conscious, in-the-moment response to whatever we're exposing them to, which is a pretty good indicator of that particular person or that particular group, how they're likely to behave in the future.
Right.
Surveys, interviews, focus groups, kind of famously are not great indicators of what people are going to do in the future, but they are really good indicators of what people are going to talk about in the future.
Okay.
Because if I am willing to share an opinion with you during a one-on-one interview after I've seen a bunch of package designs or a bunch of ads, that's probably also stuff that is going to be top of mind for me to go back and talk about to friends and family later on.
Sure.
I see a movie trailer and, in the moment I may have X, Y, or Z responses, but afterwards I say to you, wow, I thought that was a really exciting movie trailer. That's probably a movie that I'm going to be talking to my close others about later on. So that sort of temporal dichotomy of what happens in the moment versus what people report afterwards.
Right.
And then that social dichotomy of how I responded, which is probably indicating what I'm going to do in the future versus what I said out loud to you, is probably a good indicator of what I'll tell other people about that brand, that product, that film, whatever else.
And there's absolutely classes of marketing where that's what I want to achieve. I want you to talk about my product to someone else. I want to create a social currency that you get value from sharing this.
Totally. And they're completely intertwined too, right? It's very rare that I'm going to see something that I'm just completely disinterested in that I'm then going to talk to my wife or my friends or whoever else.
Share with anyone else. Yeah.
So you still need to actually give people something that's interesting enough to get their attention and get a response from them. And then from there, see, okay, and what are the features of that thing that they remembered that they're going to talk to people about later?
Give a good message to share.
Right.
Yeah. So
when we bring people into a lab-based setting, when I say I go through that process of what are the right tools for this job, you've talked on previous episodes about implicit testing. That's really good for a specific set of things that kind of no other tool does a great job of. And then in the lab, we have kind of a host of different tools or methodologies that we can think of that each of them are kind of the star of their own show for one or two particular things that no other tool does a good job of. Galvanic skin response, for example, or measuring electrodermal activity. Changes in skin sweat, usually measured from the fingers, is a really good measure of, we talked earlier about how your brain flags things as being relevant in your environment.
Right.
GSR is a great physiological indicator of those moments where your brain is tagging something as relevant.
Now, wasn't GSR like part of the so-called lie detector?
It sure is.
Wow.
And I get that question a lot.
Because they are also somewhat debunked too.
It's been debunked in the sense that being able to detect deception is still a very, very open question as to the degree to which we can actually detect whether somebody is deceiving us or not. So its function as a piece of the lie detector really kind of makes me a bit uncomfortable in terms of its validity and utility.
That's it. It's a much more complicated concept than, did you have a response to this?
Exactly. And that, at the end of the day, is really all that galvanic skin response is measuring. Now, of course, a lie detector is measuring a number of other physiological measures at the same time. And somebody is trying to kind of triangulate all of those to determine what a lie is. For me, that's the leap that's difficult, is how do you go from heart rate and GSR and respiration and movement to this person is lying, which is a very complex cognitive construct.
Yeah, that seems like a leap.
It's kind of equivalent to if your car dies suddenly and you check the oil and you think that checking the oil is going to tell you exactly what happened to your car.
There are certain circumstances where that is possible, but not likely.
Exactly. And, you might get the right answer, but you're just as likely to just end up with as confused as you were to begin with.
But GSR responses are non-voluntary. So the same way that I really liked about reaction time testing, where it's like, you can't kind of fake out reaction time. It's got a consistency to it.
Yeah, reaction time you can't fake. Galvanic skin response, again, it's an involuntary part of the fight or flight response. Now you can, and this is a big part of biofeedback, you can regulate something like your galvanic skin response with very controlled effort. So if I put a galvanic skin response sensor on your hand and I sit you in front of a screen that's showing you your real-time galvanic skin response, and I tell you that your goal is to reduce your GSR as much as possible,
right?
You'll try a bunch of different things and eventually you'll get there. Things like changing your breathing rate, exhaling deeply, all of those you'll be able to see over time kind of a reduction in your GSR. But if
that's just a straight up old biofeedback thing, right?
Exactly. But if you're sitting and you're watching a half-hour TV show and I'm measuring your galvanic skin response, I can be pretty confident that your data is not going to be lying to me about what you're experiencing.
Right.
Even if you came in with the intention of trying to screw that test up as much as possible, short of taking the sensors off your finger, you're not going to be able to do it. But again, at the end of the day, really all I'm measuring are what were those moments that were relevant to you in some way versus not.
Right.
I am not measuring, hey, Richard really loved this program. It's the best thing he's ever seen, and he's absolutely going to tune in when this premieres this coming September.
Yeah, that's projecting that's just like the lie detector. You're projecting too much intentionality on that data.
Exactly. And one of the other tools in the Neuro Toolbox where there is ample space for that kind of overinterpretation is EEG, electroencephalography. EEG has a lot of kind of sexiness to it.
It's brainwaves, after all.
It's brainwaves, and it looks sciencey.
Yeah, there's lots of squiggly lines. It's amazing. You're
putting a cap on people's heads, and it looks like hard science. And in the right circumstances, it's great hard science. It's one of the only direct measures of brain activity that we have, short of opening up somebody's skull and sticking electrodes into their brain.
Seems a little much for a marketing test. Just saying.
It's a little bit much. It's hard to get clients to buy in on that one.
So we're going to need to open up some skulls.
How exactly? What is your budget for this research?
How badly do you want this data? Because even putting the cap, like I've worn those caps, it's not exactly pleasant.
No, and it doesn't hurt by any stretch of the imagination, but you've got to put gel on your head.
Yeah, it messes up your hair.
A cap it messes up your hair. You've got this huge bundle of cords that's coming off it. In a properly controlled laboratory environment, it can be a good tool for, again, measuring some very specific cognitive processes. I think that a lot of the challenge is that many folks kind of see the squiggly lines, they see the cap, and immediately their brain goes to this place where they're thinking of, the wall of screens in Minority Report,
Right.
where you're seeing everything that's going to happen before it happens. That's absolutely not even remotely close to what EEG does. EEG can tell you things like approach versus avoidance motivation in a broad general sense over a relatively long period of data collection time. But it's gotten a lot of traction because it has this idea of we can read people's minds in any different setting.
Well, I would think MRI is like a level, it's newer tech. Now I can actually see chemical reactions almost in functional MRIs in real time to say brain activity. Although I can only show you so much when you're lying inside of a giant liquid helium cooled magnet.
Yeah. So MRI is a great tool. And in my past life as an academic, I did a lot of MRI research, and it's great for understanding specific localization of different regions of the brain that are active or not active during certain tasks. It's also incredibly expensive. And even though MRIs are very safe, they feel super invasive.
Yeah. That is a large, scary machine. Remove all metallic objects beyond this point. Like
warning signs everywhere that tell you if you haven't taken that pair of metal tweezers out of your pocket, they're going to go flying into the middle of the magnet. Yeah, it's very scary.
Well, and the fact that they put you in the machine and then everybody else leaves before they turn it on. Like, do I feel safe? This is not a good place to ask whether or not this PSA works.
Yeah, it's not one of those things that you want to go in.
Don't move a muscle. In fact, we're going to strap you down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not one of those things that you really want to go into unless it feels medically necessary.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
With EEG, though, because there is a lot of room for overinterpretation or something called reverse inference, which is where, hey, we saw this pattern of activity, so therefore, here's what was happening in the brain. The analogy that I always try to give people for what an EEG actually is and does is imagine that I am standing in the middle of Penn Station. And I'm going to be meeting a friend there because we have tickets. We're going to go see Hamilton. We're imagining that this is a universe where COVID is not
we can do that.
Doesn't exist. Penn Station is packed with people. My friend knows that I am notoriously bad about keeping my phone charged. Of course, my phone died on the train. So his strategy is that he's just going to stand somewhere in Penn Station and just call out my name until I find him and we can go to our show together.
Right.
My friend is also a bit shy, so he doesn't want to be the one buffoon who's shouting someone's name in the middle of Penn Station. He's going to just say it a little bit above normal speaking volume. Meanwhile, Penn Station is packed with people, and there are plenty of Brandons and Brendas and other folks whose friends all have the same strategy. So I'm standing in the middle of Penn Station, and I'm looking for this very faint signal, my friend's voice saying my name amidst a cacophony of other noise that has no relevance to me whatsoever. And I'm trying to detect this one very small signal. And even if I detect that signal, I'm not positive that it's the signal I'm looking for. Was that a Brendan or was that a Brenda? Was that my friend saying Brendan or is that somebody else saying Brendan? So I need to listen a couple of times until I'm pretty sure that's my friend. I hear what direction it's coming from and we can go off and see our show together. That's very similar to what we're doing when we collect EEGs, is that we're looking for very slight signals that usually have a very specific time window that they happen in amidst a huge sea of the electrical noise that is our brain.
A busy brain.
And I mentioned before, EEG really needs a very carefully controlled lab-based environment. It's measuring electrical signal, and there can be plenty of other sources of noise.
Sure.
Cabling in the room, somebody's phone outside the room, all of these things. So
they're all factors. But I feel like we're coming full circle here on all of these different strategies to do testing. And really all you can do, you can easily overwhelm yourself with unnecessary data that you kind of have to justify after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been prevalent in the industry to the point that, in the late 2000s, there were questions about whether consumer neuroscience as an industry was going to survive because there was so much of that overinterpretation and over storytelling, throwing the kitchen sink of methodologies, giving people a lot of pretty brain pictures and a great story that they can hang on to that ultimately clients didn't see any results from.
Yeah. In the end, it's did I get results?
Right. At the end, that's all that matters is did you move the needle for whatever the person hired you to do? Have you done it? And thankfully, as an industry, we've evolved beyond that. But that also means that there's a lot more complexity and due diligence that has to be done on the part of the research providers to answer those questions of, okay, I understand your business question. What tools do I think are actually going to answer it, both to protect you and your budget and also to protect myself from trying to find a story in a lot of data that's actually really useless and distracting to me.
But this also seems slightly frustrating because I've been convinced that there's not one right way to do this. And now you've made it very clear that all of the ways aren't correct either. So you got to pick a subset. And that's where kind of the art meets the science of this. I hate to use that term, but it is true. There really is an art to figuring out and understanding, is this something that I should be measuring visual attention and implicit associations and physiological relevance for? Is this actually something where being able to measure a more specific cognitive process like approach versus avoidance would be appropriate? And can I set up a lab to be able to do that? Being able to weigh those questions against what the budgetary concerns are going to be, the analysis labor, the timeline of when the person that you're speaking to needs the results. Being able to figure out that sort of balance can be really challenging. The good news is that there's really not one right answer necessarily to most of those questions. If you talk to two good neuroscientists and you give them the same problem, they may come back with two similar but different answers, both of which are completely valid ways to answer the question. And again, it kind of comes back to what actually is the ground truth. Is there a real world outcome that you can measure and track and determine, hey, we did this the right way, or hey, maybe we should have thought about doing something a little bit differently here. But I also feel like I'm a more informed marketer at this point if I'm having a conversation about neuroscience to say, hey, I want to be familiar with 3 or 4 of these strategies to gather data around testing the marketing that I want to do and see how will each of these influence our decision making long term to actually pick. I also feel like you made it very clear. It's like, don't make 3 ads and figure out which one's the quote best one. Like that, I probably want to test elements of this, maybe do some creative in advance, and then try some elements to say, should we put more time into more creative around this aspect? Because it is soliciting responses we see as valuable.
And that's one of the things that I've always tried to, when it's economically feasible for clients to do, to try to consider, right, is, sure, you can do a test in a vacuum. And if you want to know what's working versus what's not with this product, this user interface, this ad, you can definitely get some data to help you down that path. But the most value is with the institutional learning that comes from doing that type of testing. The value isn't necessarily the most realized in how does an individual interface perform, or what sorts of responses does it get from people? How does an individual ad or package design get from people? It's more about the institutional knowledge that's built over time of doing many different iterations of this type of testing, so that we mentioned before, right, that there's no master checklist of here are the things that work with consumers, here are the things that don't. But when we start to narrow that sphere down to your brand, your specific product, the specific service that you have, there are going to start to emerge some guardrails of, hey, with my target audience, here are the things that they seem to care more about that tend to get a more favorable response from them. Versus here are the things that really just aren't working with them. And you can start to weave those into your future creative. And when I've been fortunate enough over the years to work with companies that have done those types of repeated or regimented testing, it's borne fruit for them relatively quickly, because I've started to see within 2 or 3 cycles of testing what comes back from their creative teams starts to have incorporated in it some of the things that we had told them on the previous test. Hey, try and do a little bit more of this, or maybe a little bit less of this. And that snowball effect that you get over time starts to pay real dividends in terms of the outcome for their product or service.
Yeah, right. And you're always collecting demographic data off the back of this. So you know who you were testing, whether it was done online or in a lab or whatever methods you've got. So you are going to build up this body of knowledge of, we have, communicated or done testing with these sorts of folks, and we've gotten these kinds of results. And it sort of leads to, what does your marketplace look like? What your brand reactions look like over time? Like, you can really become a more informed marketer for your company.
Yeah. And for better or for worse, I think that that's one of the as yet really untapped pieces of potential within the neuroscience industry, is that in those sorts of focus domains, we can start to get a really good sense of what different groups prioritize in terms of what it is that they're interested in from an emotional perspective.
Sure.
Meaning by that, not necessarily trying to paint with that broad brush of, all of X, Y, and Z group tend to do A, B, and C, or all of EFG group do yada, yada, yada.
Right.
It's more, hey, in this specific context, when this is the type of message that you're looking to deliver to this particular audience, this is what this audience generally responds to,
right,
and what typically gets their attention, and the sorts of visual features that they're looking for or expecting. It's a lot of it is about managing the expectations of consumers,
sure,
right? We all go into any experience. I use ads because it's an easy example. I could just as easily use something like a virtual reality experience, or some sort of immersive real world experience, or something like sitting on a brand new type of airline that has, new features and whatever else. Yeah. As consumers, we go into those things with expectations based on our past experience and our hopes and beliefs and whatever else, some of that relevant to brands, others not. And all of those things are measurable over time. And you can start to get this really interesting and rich picture informed by data of what those expectations are.
Yeah.
And, the question comes up a lot. Is consumer neuroscience just helping people buy more shit that they don't need?
Yeah.
And
fair.
I think that's a completely fair, albeit I would say pessimistic way to look at it.
Yeah, but also making PSAs that help people, communicating messages that are important to folks, understanding when products are working for folks and are not. When you change packaging and now you frustrate a customer because they can't find your brand anymore. Like, these are not automatically just buying stuff you don't need, but rather making a complex life better, easier.
And that's exactly the perfect encapsulation of how I think of it and how I try to explain it to people, right? Is that there is no magic button that you as a marketer can push in somebody's brain to make them buy a product that they weren't interested in the first place. What you can do is you can help facilitate their access to information on stuff that they care about, so that they can make better and more engaged and more informed decisions about what it is that they're going to do or purchase or experience or whatever else in the future. It's meeting or exceeding those expectations that they're bringing to bear and saying, hey, actually, yes, this is the thing that you're looking for. And to be able to give them that messaging in a way that's actually compelling and interesting to them and lets them process that information in a way that's more natural to them.
Low cost to their attention so they can get to an outcome they actually desired.
Exactly.
That's very, very powerful. I think we should probably leave it right there, Brendan. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
Very, very fun conversation to sort of think about. It occurred to me, boy, neuroscientists must be difficult consumers. You probably have a very different look when you add advertising and packaging, and
and this is what gives me so much faith and interest in the industry that I work in, is that I shut off my neuroscience brain as soon as I'm in my normal life.
Right.
I am just as susceptible to advertising, and I had this perfect experience over the weekend. I have this experience frequently. Went into my favorite local craft beer store, and it's a very strangely situated store in that the beer section of the store has no cell phone service. And I really like to be able to look up ratings for different beers that I haven't tried before. And I can't do it in the store, which happens to be the one in my town that has by far the best selection of beer out of anywhere. So I go in and I'm just flying blind. And every time I go in, I'm trying to try a new brand of beer. And without fail, I am buying beer based on what the label looks like.
Yeah.
I look and I see, is it an IPA? Okay, I like IPAs. That's a really cool design. I feel like they probably put a lot of time and care and attention into this.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I am the ideal consumer for most marketers.
As much work as I've done in marketing, that's only given me appreciation that I am just as susceptible to branding as anyone else.
Yeah.
No amount of knowledge will overcome arguably good neuroscience, well-crafted messages that can affect you.
And Richard, I like to think that just means that we are enlightened, because so many people think that they are not affected by advertising. We know that we are.
Yeah, we are. Just admit it. That's what enlightenment looks like. I am but another mortal being in this coil.
That's what enlightenment in 2021 is all about. Knowing that you're buying beer because of the picture on it.
Yeah, because the picture was good. Now, definitely got some wine bottles look just like that. Dr. Brendan Murray, thanks so much for coming to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Richard. This was an absolute pleasure.
And we'll talk to you on the next episode of Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.